Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Today on the podcast, we are tackling one of the most significant, tragic, and complex incidents in the modern history of UK firefighting, the Grenfell Tower fire. On the 14th of June 2017, a fire broke out on a 24-storey Grenfell Tower block. This is a set of flats in North Kensington, West London, claiming countless lives and changing even more forever. The blaze began on the fourth floor flat and within minutes rapidly engulfed the building due to the combustible cladding and insulation used on the exterior, creating a catastrophic failure in the fire safety systems designed to keep everybody safe. Over 250 firefighters were mobilised in one of the largest peacetime fire operations in the UK, facing unimaginable heat, rapidly spreading fire, and an unprecedented rescue situation in the middle of the night. Now, Grenfell wasn't just a tragic incident, it was, or should have been, a turning point that exposed gaps in building safety regulations, enforcement training, and the preparedness of the fire and rescue services for the challenges of modern high-rise fires in a complex built environment. Today we're going to dive into it as I'm joined by my good friend Steve McGuirk. Steve is a voice in the fire sector whose perspective on Grenfell is both deeply informed and urgently needed. Steve served as a fire chief for nearly 17 years during a time of significant change within our sector, leading through the introduction of integrated risk management, the Fire and Rescue Services Act. He has led during austerity, national industrial action, and through the tragic loss of firefighter and colleague in the central Manchester, navigating the intense organisational and personal challenges that follow a death in the line of duty. Since retiring from frontline leadership, Steve's impact has not slowed down. He has served as non-executive chair of a hospital foundation trust, and for the past several years, he has acted as an expert witness for the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, focusing on operational aspects of the tragedy and what it means for the future of firefighting. Steve is also the executive officer of the Fire Sector Federation, helping the fire sector learn from the tragedy of Grenfell, working with the Home Office on fire risk assessor registration and competency, and pushing forward the conversation around how we build a coordinated, evidence-led fire safety system that can adapt to the modern world. In our conversation today, we unpacked the complexities of fire command in a world of increasingly complex buildings, the necessity for realistic, arduous, and intellectually engaged training that prepares firefighters and incident commanders for scrutiny and the harsh realities of catastrophic incidents like Grenfell, the critical need for organisational learning and cultural shifts within the fire and rescue services, and how we can move beyond relying solely on government interventions. We'll talk about the role of technology and rational optimism in shaping the future of our profession, the challenges of leadership during crisis, and the courage required to make decisions when the stakes are highest. And crucially, we talk about what the fire sector must learn from Grenfell and what must change to prevent another tragedy. Grenfell revealed harsh truths about fire safety regulations, operational preparedness, and the deeply human impact of systemic failures. It challenged our sector to confront uncomfortable realities, just as the airline industry did after the Kegworth disaster in the 80s, which of course led to culture of black box thinking that prioritizes truth over comfort. Steve will also share insights from nearly 50 years in the fire sector, a journey that began when he joined at 16, all the way through to today when he continues to learn and challenge the sector to do better, be braver, and be prepared for a world that will only grow in its complexity. This is an episode for every single firefighter, officers, and leaders who want to understand not just what happened to Grenfell, but what it means for us now and for the future of the fire and rescue services. It is an episode about accountability, learning, and the unflinching courage required to change a system in honour of those who paid the ultimate price. So grab your notepad, open up your mind, and settle in. This, once again, is the Firefighters podcast, and today, please welcome my good friend, Steve McGuirk. I'll see you on the other side. Fire Service Act, Regulatory Reform Order, Atherstone-on-Store, Marley Farm, the loss of Stephen Hunt, and now expert witness on the Grenfell Tower Inquiry. You have had a really unique lens through which to see learnings in the wider first responder sector, but certainly in the fire service. How do you think we're doing in terms of learning from mistakes?
It's a good question, Pete. Supposed to be honest, this expression learning gets just sprinkled over everything as if it's a magic dust, and we can now almost take for granted that something called learning is going to happen from mistakes. Since I retired from the fire service, I have a life in the NHS, and that organisation similarly sprinkles the learning magic dust over every failure. The problem with it is, I think it actually can make it a bit too easy to avoid confronting failure. In a world of today, I think I think COVID had an effect as well, that people want to cherish what's good. We want to hang on to, we want positivity. There's enough negativity in the world, and as human beings, our default state is to try and be positive and upbeat about the future. We want to grab hold of positivity and build on the positivity. And every debrief starts with, let's work out what went well. And then everybody runs out of road to really get into what went badly. And if I'm honest, I think I'm not so sure we've learned a great deal, if I'm truthful about it. Actually, what we have become is more and more risk averse. And I think we risk the creation of this idea, and we had the tragedy in Oxfordshire the other week, didn't we? The idea that we can, the advancement in technology, training kit capability, etc., creates essentially a risk-free environment for operational firefighting. And as long as we stick together, things like a dynamic risk assessment or an analytical risk assessment, or the relevant NOG or whatever, the operational firefighting is really a collection of procedures, is a proceduralization, and we know all the answers, and it's only a question of almost selecting the right one. Where the truth is, was it Brian Clough said, we had a great team on paper, unfortunately the game was played on grass. And I had a lovely expression several years ago: firefighting is a full contact sport. And I kind of buy into that. And if you read the expert report on Grenfell, I think some of the challenges were the lack of lack of training at all in some cases, but certainly the lack of any kind of realistic training that prepared people for the rigor and toughness of what they were going to find on that night. And the same is true of all those issues you just explained there. I mean, the tragedy of Stephen, we really put a long, hard look into ourselves. And actually, the training centre that we've now constructed, it was started when I was the fire chief there. It was finished probably a few months after I left. I would say that is world-class operational training.
100%.
But the kind of parameters were, we need to be able to light real fires that reflect reality. So we need to get set fire to a sulphur, because that's what burns in reality. So I think sure, we'll go on and talk about it, but I think there are some real challenges about the kind of hard-nosed rigor of the training or the preparation that we need to think about on the back of all those disasters.
I'm going to
agree.
I'm going to agree with you, but I'm going to pivot it ever so slightly and go, I think most of us try and be net positive, but I think we've evolved to be negative pessimists, because the pessimists survive. If me and Steve are out in the wilderness and Pete goes, oh, I think that's a butterfly in the bushes, and Steve goes, no, I think it's a saber-toothed tiger, likelihood is the pessimist will survive. There's a lot of negativity in our sector, but I agree with you when it falls into, that was a tragedy, look, come on, we're good, we know we're good, let's move on. I think that's where the optimism comes in, and I think we analyze these things well to say what went wrong. I think we're pretty good at saying what went wrong. We're not good at the learning. I agree with you. So what I'm saying is, we point at things well, and it's the so what. It's the afterwards. It's the so what. It's the go, so what are we going to do different from that? And if I look at an example of a really good learning, even though I have my own personal frustrations with entry control boards, is when we first brought in entry control boards. After the tragedies in London, and the old photos of with the chalkboard outside. And I think that was a very simplistic, very, very old example of where we took a very hard left turn and we saw a real change in an operational tactic. But Yeah, so many of the things that have happened since. Dan Stevens talks about this very passionately. He's like, we've got to do something about this. We can't just go tragedy. You mentioned about the NHS, because you're absolutely right. I remember I had Martin Bromley on the podcast probably 4 or 5 years ago. And his story, I've said it ad nauseum on the podcast. I won't bore people too much with it. But his wife passed away, Elaine Bromley.
He was the guy in the Matthew Said book, I think, wasn't he? Is that the same guy?
Matthew Syed's Bounce. At the beginning of that, no, apologies, Black Box Thinking.
Black Box Thinking, yeah.
Where he says, he's an airline pilot. He flies the Airbuses out of an airport in the UK. I won't say where, because I think he still does it. And he said, well, there's been a real disaster. In aviation, a disaster doesn't even have to happen. Like if a disaster nearly happened and there was an electronic issue, it will be heavily investigated, and they will make a change to the cockpit or where we sit or the size of a handle or a knob or a thing or whatever. He was astonished to see that similar learnings weren't happening in the NHS and that things were just written off as catastrophes. And, the human body is very complex. This was a unique situation. There was a complication during surgery and. And then they come up with, he goes around training on crew resource management. Yeah, fantastic. I think there's elements that we can learn on the fireground in terms of how to appropriately challenge when we feel like we've gone left a long time before and now we're way off path, or we've pursued a tactic that is no longer, we do that cyclic review in the decision-making model, and we think, well, we're not getting the outcome that we're trying to get at the minute, and we're still doing it. Maybe there's echoes here of Grenfell as well. We haven't historically been good at saying, let's draw a line. It was a good idea at the time, echoing back to Elaine's situation. They were trying to intubate her, wasn't working, brain dead issue. She had to be put on life support and unfortunately switched off after a period of time. So I think the learnings is the thing that we're not fantastic at. And this speaks volumes. We both spoke predominantly, a lot of our conversation is going to evolve around some of the Grenfell learnings. You were expert witness for a long period of time during this. We both spoke about just recently watching the Netflix documentary again. We watched that again. I saw it again this morning. Peter Apps, who we had on the podcast a little while ago, features quite heavily in it. We'll go into his involvement and how deeply that was. But one thing we both do acknowledge was the great piece of writing he has at the beginning of his book. I mean, it's all very good, but when he speaks about Lakanal House. So what I want to try and do today in my long waffle there is I want this conversation to stand the test of time. So as we move through our conversation today, I'll probably end up stopping us a few times because I want us to try and learn these lessons well. So I want this to, in 7 years' time, when a brand new recruit is listening to it, I want us to get specific about some dates and things like that. So assume I'm a brand new recruit. Start by telling us a little bit around what was Grenfell and what was Lakanal House.
So before I forget, Pete, can we circle back to a couple of points you made there about pessimism versus optimism? I want to just make it all to come back to the kind of idea of rational optimism, because I think there is a place in the middle, and a thing called the Stockdale paradox. And I also want to come back to ops assurance as well, thing that is ops assurance. So if you just make a note, we'll circle back to them. So Grenfell. So I was with Grenfell throughout the whole of its period of time. I got involved within several weeks. In September 2017, I got asked to get involved, and I finished on the day the report was published, as all the expert witnesses did. So I was with it pretty much. I don't know whether there was a first expert appointed, but I was certainly amongst the first appointed right from the outset. And the reason being, the chairman, Sir Martin, was keen to get going with phase one, and which was going to be the operational consideration of what happened on the night. So they were very keen to get work going on that. So the Grenfell Tower tragedy, the biggest loss of life in this country in a fire since the Second World War, and I would say it was a global event. It was in many ways a modern tragedy in that it was played out across the world's media in a way that other tragedies before, and I'm not so sure as many since, have been played out in that way. I've seen footage live from helicopters. I think Sky was syndicating some of their footage to India, to Pakistan, to Australia, within a very short space of time, there were several helicopters hovering around the tragedy, filming it unfold. And it was live on YouTube. And, I'm not sure
all of the freelance,
everything.
people there with their mobile phones.
So it was a tragedy of the modern age for sure. And as the Inquiry and the that Netflix documentary that just recently on, and I'm sure that'll still be available for people even in years to come. Essentially, what it illustrated was a broken system from end to end. And in fact, no system at all, wasn't it? Right from the operational response of the London Fire Brigade, which was expected to be at a very, very high level. And this is not in any way to be critical of the bravery and heroism of the crews concerned, because that is without question. But we can't let that courage and bravery prevent us from looking in an objective way at what was actually done and what was known and might have been done differently in light of what was known.
It's an emotionally heavy topic, isn't it? And as soon as anyone starts to question a tactic, some people layer up onto that an accusation of competence or bravery, and that's not. We need to separate that to look at this dispassionately.
I don't know. So there's several books around Grenfell, but there's two I like, and they are flip sides of a similar coin. The Peter Apps book, with a lady called Jill Koenig. I don't know if you've had Jill on the podcast. So Jill was a resident of Grenfell Tower. But not on the night. She'd moved house. Jill's specialism, she worked for Arups on the engineering side. She speaks a lot on the community side, Jill. So she's written a book about the systemic catastrophe that this was. But she talks about the heroes and villains narrative, and she makes a really good point. Two things can be true at the same time. It is true that this building should never have been in this state, and that's my point about the whole system, whether it's the building control, building regulations, the construction products, the fire risk assessment, end to end, every bit of it was broken. So in one level, you might say the building should have never been in that state in the first place. But the fact is, we turn out as operational crews every single day to stuff that shouldn't have happened. That car shouldn't have crashed there. That water shouldn't have leaked there. We shouldn't be putting excrement into the rivers of this country every day, but we do. The fact is, we are an emergency service. So by definition, we're only going to get called when there's been an emergency. And if nothing had happened, that was
default is the deck is
it wouldn't have been an emergency. It would have been sorted out by now. So we can't kind of, in my view, I suppose, have our cake and eat it. So it can also be true that our response wasn't of the order it could have been had we learned lessons, which then brings us back to the Lakanal house fire. So the Lakanal house fire was a fire several years early in 2009 with similar dimensions. I don't think Lakanal was quite a ready comparison to Grenfell. I know it sounds like that now, but there were a lot of aspects of Lakanal that were different, but several things were similar. This fire spread in unusual directions. It breached the compartment, and that breach wasn't registered in terms of its significance. There were 3 fire survival guidance calls and 6 people perished, but there were only 3 calls, and that collapsed essentially, or overwhelmed rather than collapsed, the response of London Fire Brigade's control centre. Well, there were several lessons to be learned from Lakanal that we, with the benefit of hindsight, we look back saying, had we learned those lessons, then potentially Grenfell would have been very different. And there's a strong school of thought that says, well, we ought to have learned those lessons because there was then an inquest, and the coroner, as was identified in the Netflix documentary, wrote very specific learning from death letters to all the people concerned, with really clear recommendations about what they need to do in terms of training, equipment, capability, and so on. And the evidence of Grenfell suggests, for several reasons, those lessons were not learned by the time things came to Grenfell. Now, very, very easy to say, well, and at one level, from the victim's point of view, that's fair enough. They've every right to be frustrated and angry by that. On the other hand, fire and rescue services had a lot going on about that period of time, not least in London. They had the Olympics going on. We had 2 years of industrial intermittent strikes for industrial action. We had this little matter of a thing called austerity. The National Fire Control Project collapsed towards the end of 2009. 2010. The Fire Service College was sold to Capita in 2010. So there was a lot going on in fire rescue services at that time, as well as specifically in the London Fire Brigade. The second dimension is within very few months of Lacanau, we had the Shirley Towers tragedy, where two firefighters perished in Shirley Towers. And I know you've covered that extensively on this podcast as well.
This episode is brought to you in partnership with Godiva Limited. Godiva is one of the world's leading providers of specialist equipment for emergency services market. Godiva produces a comprehensive range of fire pumps, including vehicle-mounted, portable, and their cutting-edge integrated total water flow control system, SAMFlows. I've been using Godiva my entire career as a reliable pump on the fire ground. It is such a crucial element of a successful firefighting team that you want to empower your crews with the very best, reliable, quality product. Reach out to our partners by checking the notes in the podcast. Now back to the show.
I remember Lacanau because as a chief, we then kind of went out, we checked our kind of 7.2D stuff, risk information. We kind of refreshed what we were doing with the high-rise buildings. I was in Cheshire at the time. We didn't have a huge number of high-rise. So there absolutely was activity kicked in after Lacanau, but it bore no comparison at all to the activity that kicked in after Shirley Towers, where two firefighters died. After that, we all bought new BA sets, we all wire cutters, training programs, and the other coincidence, whether you think it's good, bad, or indifferent, it's a coincidence. The inquest for Shirley Towers occurred within 2 weeks of the inquest for Lacanau House. Now, again, I genuinely don't remember as a chief, and I've shared this with colleagues in the inquiry, a huge amount of debate about the impact of the Lacanau House tragedy on the collective thinking of fire and rescue services. I absolutely do remember a debate about the impact of Shirley Towers everywhere, including sharing from Hampshire Fire and Rescue Service, videos, etc., etc. There's a huge amount of discussion. After Lacanau, I think the kind of collective of the fire service community, I think, was largely silent. It was generally seen as a set of challenges for the London Fire Brigade rather than a set of challenges for fire rescue services more widely. We saw it
as a local problem.
We saw firefighter safety as the challenge, not public safety. And bear in mind, we'd had that, two firefighters killed in Hertfordshire in mid-2000s. There was a station manager in Glasgow, in Strathclyde, nearly perished a couple of years later. You know, the fire services view was high-rise firefighting, and they're right, by the way, is tactically, professionally, the most challenging type of fire we are going to deal with. And if you look statistically, probably, I've not done the maths on it, but probably more firefighters have died fighting fires in high-rise buildings. It's certainly been more high profile in recent years than in most other buildings or most other kind of situations. So as a fire chief, it felt very, very, very immediate to me, Shirley Towers. And I've got to be honest, the Lacanau House didn't feel like that at the time.
I think there was a really heavy shift obviously post Grenfell, but also a few of the others that you referenced was probably where the drip started to happen. Because when you talk about fire services response, we have to draw a line at what point is this within our sphere of influence or within our sphere of control, i.e. changing our operational tactics. Yes, there's things we can do about that. But the heavy investment in fire protection officers, as an example, came post Grenfell. We decided to much more heavily step beyond the threshold of the fire stations and start to intrude into businesses, organizations. They almost showed that they were swimming naked in some of these incidents where we had a belief that they were managing their buildings appropriately, that, you know, the correct investment and procurement of these materials had been diligently tracked and traced and all that sort of jazz, because we were still living in the stay put world, weren't we? It's been a real shift where now we've stepped heavily across the threshold, if you will, and said, we can't trust you anymore. You need to demonstrate to me, because you're marking your own homework, and these buildings, it's almost like we weren't reading the same rule book going into the game, because like you've already referenced, firefighters are entering into these imperfect situations under the understanding that these are emergency situations and they're going to be imperfect by their very nature. But the level of uncertainty and the failure in assumed ways that these buildings would behave was, I think, the bigger shift with Grenfell, just to how quickly it seemed to behave.
I'm not sure I'd agree with that. I think the reality is that very, very, very few to almost none senior officers in fire rescue service have got any experience whatsoever. What we call it various things: fire protection, fire safety, business safety. We've labelled it. The reality is, up until the 2005 regulatory reform order, we policed fire safety in this country. We used to go and inspect buildings, and if they were good enough, we'd even give them a certificate. We'd tell them what they needed to do, what's called the steps to be taken notice, using the relevant legislation. And if they did it, we'd give them a certificate. And if they didn't, we'd prosecute them. That fundamentally changed.
Very few prosecutions ever happened, though, did they?
Under the old legislation, prior to the 2005, well, it's difficult to say. Probably more
we haven't got the numbers in front of us, but just from
But because one of the problems was it was diffused to about 100 and odd pieces of legislation through the license. So that was one of the problems, this very kind of complex landscape of legislation that wove fire prevention, as it was in those days, of fire protection throughout. Regulatory reform order comes in, it does 2 or 3 big things. And bear in mind, often these things are events coming together. We'd had all the kind of Bain review, fundamental resetting of what fire and rescue services do, and at its core was a belief that fire services role was in educating the public. In fact, that became a statutory duty in the 2004 Act, where previously it hadn't been. And so the belief that we could save lives by prevention, safety and education really came in, and they were right, because that's what's happened. It was the right thing to do, but it really wasn't a thing much before then. There were only a handful of fire and rescue services really into the community fire safety aspect. You find it difficult to believe that now, 20 years on, but it was really quite unusual. What they had been doing was the legislative side. Now, 2005 Act comes along and it does probably 3 big things. The first thing it does, fundamentally change the role of what fire services, fire authorities did. And they moved away from being the advisors and the guardians of fire safety through issuing certificates, from becoming a true policing role, i.e. like the police. So if you did something wrong, their job was to prosecute. The extent to which that landed is very mixed. Up until 2019, there were 3 fire and rescue authorities in this country that never prosecuted anybody under the regulatory reform.
Yeah.
So either in unbelievably safe places, or it hadn't landed that your job is to prosecute.
I don't think we invested enough in the qualifications and academic rigor, because these were sub-officers, watch managers going out, still doing 7.2Ds, but with a power they didn't really understand, I think. And that's my words.
I think there's a level above that. I'm not sure it landed, because in the old days, it's always been called the black art or whatever you want to call it. In the old days, operations were always given primacy. So very few chiefs, even in the old days, came through fire safety or fire prevention as a background. And in fact, so there were several attempts to take fire safety off fire and rescue services and give it either to the health safety executive or local authority building control, because it wasn't felt that the fire services had the expertise. And interestingly, colleagues and trade unions fought very strongly to retain the responsibility within fire and rescue, arguing, and I support their view, by the way, that fire service is best placed given its operational experience. So these 2 things sit side by side.
But we can connect the dots to what the operational requirements and what it's going to manifest into when we try and interact with a failing building.
Completely. And so that information is important for operational reasons as well. So the first shift, we became police, and I'm not sure that landed. And your point about were people trained and all the rest of it. But the second shift it was absolutely clear that from a political policy point of view, fire safety was now seen within a basket of safety matters that were wrapped up under this heading of health and safety. And it was no more complex and no more difficult than any of those. So from a health and safety point of view, you can download a friendly guide off our government website and do your own risk assessment. And it was absolutely clear that was the intention of fire safety. It was seen in that way. Hence the guides that have only just been changed this year. They've still been there this year.
Yeah, I saw the latest B5.
Yeah, it was a philosophical idea that this phenomenon of fire is no more complicated than these other matters of health and safety. And if people are perfectly capable of making judgments of that with a downloadable guide, what's so complicated about fire safety that makes it different? That was a clear political ideological shift. And that moved from a basis of fire risk assessment then. So you do your own fire risk assessment based upon that. What the old fire service does is come along and police it. And if they think it's good enough, tick. And if they don't, prosecute. That's it. That's simple.
Yeah,
so the final thing I'd say on that, Pete, is the trigger then that suggested it's not quite that simple and it's a bit more complicated was in fact Lakanal House.
I was about to say, because have you ever looked into the difference between complex and complicated systems?
Indeed. Complex adaptive systems is a bit of a thing we're into at the minute.
Yeah, and I don't want to get into buzzword bingo, but fire safety is complicated.
Yeah.
But firefighting is complex in my head. And I'm exploring this thought live as I speak to you. But so for people a car is a complicated system. But as long as you follow the 157 steps, the combustion engine will work. It's physics and it's just how physics and science and chemistry work. One of my favorite guests, Carol Lambert, said the same. He said, firefighting, as much as we try and be romantic about it, it's just chemistry and physics. And I went, it is in its rawest form. But anyway, to apply this template to our conversation,
nuclear fusion.
Fire safety in buildings is all measurements, resistance. Is there certain things in certain places, vents and distances and incandescent seals and correct monitoring and alarm systems and all that sort of jazz. Complicated. When it moves into firefighting and our interaction with that system, because there are so many human behavior factors, it becomes complex. Would you agree with that? Am I being too romantic?
I totally agree. But I'd probably go even, well, you said you don't want to do the buzzword bingo, but I think it's a wiki problem as well in that kind of topic.
Yes.
Your point about the kind of fire safety systems, smoke alarm systems and the whole fire engineering world.
Yes. A
complex building, I don't know. The Lloyd's insurance building, these are complex. But essentially it's all done on some assumptions, isn't it? About a size of a fire and about a location of a fire. And even the most sophisticated, what they call them CFD, the computational fluid modeling.
Fluid dynamics, yeah.
But actually, the basic data for most of those tools goes back to experiments in fires many years ago. And it's just nobody's set fire to things in the last few years to come up with any new models. But here's the thing, fire's changed. And so many of the tragedies that you've identified have revealed several new phenomenon that until those fires were not known. The trench effect is a good one, King's Cross. You've talked about Coanda effect on this, haven't you? The 421 effect. And we're now getting lithium ion, green walls, hyper-insulated buildings. And so
just, sorry, because I want to remember what we're saying about not losing the listener. So 421, fire in the middle of a room, growth rate 1.
Yeah,
against the side of a building, growth rate 2. Yeah. In the corner of a room, it will grow at 4 times the rate. And the Coanda effect, people can YouTube it. Yeah. It's a sloped. You see several experiments, a straight wall, a flat, a sloped. And when we're talking about King's Cross, they're talking about the elevators and the Coanda. I don't want to lose anybody and they go, oh God, I can't understand what they're on about now.
It's a really good point, Pete. So, I mean, the point is there are huge numbers of combustion phenomena, let's use that expression, that emerge, which is science and maths and physics, isn't it? Which emerge from fires. Now, why are they important? Because if we take the 421 effect, so really that is saying get the same fire using exactly the same fire load and the same bits of wood, the same root dimension. There's some good YouTube footage on this. My old fire service guy from Greater Manchester put some cracking stuff up online and this stuff. and you just light the fire at exactly the same time and just put it in a different part of the room. Everything's exactly the same. All that's changed is where in the room you put the fire. And the effect of that is unbelievable in terms of the ferocity of the fire. So why that is important is there used to be an expression in the front page of all the old manuals, swing a few lamps here, the old manuals of firemanship, which is what they were. They used to have this opening paragraph that said, no two fires are alike. All fires are unique. And it was almost this kind of twee expression that rolled off the tongue. But they're absolutely right, aren't they? So that 4-2-1 effect illustrates the point. And you don't even know what's going on. There's a shut door. Even if you've done a 7-2D, since the last time you were, they might have stacked it full of fireworks, or they could have stacked it full of anything. And so the reality is, genuinely, every single fire is truly unique. So all the various sheep dips, DRA, you rock up, you do your dynamic risk assessment, you select your tactical plan. It's almost kind of bish, bash, and a bosh, and away you go. The job's a good one. And all you've now got to worry about is you get your tabard on, put your eyes to the old kind of marshalling point, do your out. It is this managerialization of the instant ground, I think, has created a terrible and false sense of security that doesn't exist. And I'm completely with Dan this. If anything, fires burn hotter, faster, and they produce more toxic effluents than they've ever done at any time in human history. And yet we treat them as if it's a simple 2 and 2 = 4 equation.
I just use this simple one of children's toys or sofas when I use presentations in like fire behavior things. I go, kids' toys 40 years ago were made like this. Now they're made of all of these polyethylenes and this, and everyone take out any electronic item you've got on you. How many lithium ion batteries are in the room? Elements like that. A sofa, the way that that's constructed. You try and lift an old sofa, it's heavy. I couldn't move it on my own, but now I can pick a sofa up, throw it around the room because of the things that it's made of.
I'd add to it as well the complexity about the poor beggars who were trying to make a bloody decision in the middle of this lot, the incident commanders. Because as well as it being bloody complicated, to use the vernacular, the poor beggars rocking up, even if they've been well trained, they are only human beings. And there's more neuroscience and neurobiology playing into this space as well. So, when we're in crisis, again, don't get too deep on the neurobiology. There's good stuff online, and you can look at, is it Steve Peters and chimp paradox, or Newton, what is the Klein and his recognition prime decision making? And most fire services are doing something in this territory.
Decision vortex and all that jazz.
About how decisions are made. And, I'm summarizing, decades of research and a million PhDs.
Let's fumble our way through this one. But
in a nutshell, essentially, they're broadly saying the way we're wired from an evolutionary perspective means that our brains operate roughly in 2 ways. There's a fast, intuitive, dynamic bit of your brain that kicks in straight away, and it is far more likely to kick in if you're in fight or flight mode or you're facing a crisis or the smell
your
of
limbic system. Man.
Yep. The other side of your brain is the thoughtful, reflective, analytical.
Your prefrontal cortex needs all of that information. It operates slower and it wants all of this processing power.
There's a lot of proper neuro research on this. When they've had people having brain surgery, they've tested
stimulating different bits.
There's good science and proper biology. It's not just off the back of kind of Wikipedia or something. There's some good stuff on this. Sorry, but let me turn that.
You're right.
But whether we like it or not, these are not within our control. This is not a gift for us to control. How we react in a given situation is determined just by the way we're wired. And so what I think the consequence of that, Pete, is until you're faced with that kind of crisis situation, you don't really know how you're going to react. And actually, it's the first time that you're really facing a stressful, rigorous, truly demanding emergency is the first time you've got a problem. So as well as the complexity that you describe of a wicked problem and no two are the same, for which you need to know enough about science to know what's going on, enough about building construction to know what's going on, enough about architecture to know what's going on, enough about a whole range of operational tactics that you might be able to call upon in these circumstances, and fluid dynamics, water supply, jets, and then over here, the presence of mind not to fall into the natural biological response of most human beings, which is to leg it, because this is a dangerous thing to do, isn't it? And in amongst all of that lot, you've got to do the old swan and look calm because people are looking to you for some leadership. Yeah. These are really, really difficult leadership roles, in my opinion.
Do you think there's an element of, I want to echo back on the research for a second. So you spoke about things like fluid dynamics and our tactics and things like that. The vast majority of organizations, we're not training things like flow paths. We're not training Coanda effects. We're not, we talk about Paul Grimwood's work and, effective water application and the amount required for certain megawatt loading of buildings or of rooms and the fireground calculations of, area times 5 and stuff like that. A lot of this isn't even in training. So, and I'm not standing here saying, "Oh God, I can't believe no one else knows it. I know so much." Not at all. Like I've just come across these things. These don't even exist in the organization that I work for. But that is, if you follow the thread back far enough, when someone says we need a certain literage on any floor of a high-rise building, it comes back to those calculations, but we don't train them. And then building construction, you mentioned there, which is going to form, a part of our conversation around Grenfell. Yeah, it's in the old manuals of firemanship, but it's not taught to recruits in, I'm going to put my finger in the air and say 90%. Mine's not great, and it's only okay as it is because my dad was a builder for 40 years. So he walked me around sites when I was in the evenings and on the weekends whilst he was measuring up jobs, and he was pointing at things and telling me about things and crawling into people's lofts and showing me stuff. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't something I'd picked up in the fire service. I think people that have those pockets of knowledge at this point in time are by accident, not by design.
There never was a golden day, by the way, that when it was all fine. I've got to be on.
Yeah, and I'm sure there wasn't.
I remember my first day, 1978, walking across the yard at Bolton. And a guy kind of doing the old clear the fire. Don't know what you're joining this for. It's bloody gone to pieces. And he said morale's at rock bottom, and he never got any higher than rock bottom, I don't think, in 39 years. It was the highest it ever got. No, I think you're absolutely right. So the science and the stuff.
We don't do a lot of research anymore. I always think we're too busy to be intelligent.
Have we learned from all these disasters? No, we're not. I mean, if you take Paul Grimwood's work, it's not rocket science. In 2004, after 9/11, there was a huge amount of government-funded research went into fighting fires in high-rise buildings. All the physiology stuff that we've just kind of come out this last couple of years, it's hard. I know. There was a report done in 2005 that did exactly the same.
I always say we need to remember more than we need to learn. And Manchester are doing Manchester and Lancashire and a couple of others are doing a fantastic job. I'm part of a tactical firefighting group where we discuss this day in and day out, but they're just the sad, freaky nerds like me. Most people don't know who Paul Grimwood is, I would say. I'd say if you walk through most fire stations, they wouldn't be able to tell you who he is.
And nothing, you're right. And what fantastic guy Paul was, bless his cotton socks. He was called as a witness to Grenfell based upon my expert report, where I thought Paul had a huge amount to kind of contribute, and his evidence was superb. It speaks to the point where do we learn? So, if in 2005 there was several pieces of really important research that proved beyond any doubt physiology is a problem in high-rise buildings. We were all squirting water is a bit of a problem through a 100mm diameter pipe because there's a limit at going up fictional excess.
Water pressure in the UK comes off the residential feed. It's not great.
It is science. So on the back of that, we were all strongly advised to go out and buy 51 and 52mm hose. Today, 20 years on, there are still brigades in this country with high-rise buildings who don't have that 52mm, and it's been a recommendation for 20 years. 20 years. We were all recommended to go out and get a high-rise grab pack because guess what? It's heavy carrying this kit up a high-rise building. Yeah. Really useful if you've thought about the kit you need beforehand and have it in this nice little box or bag, so you just get up and rock in. So So, and then you come into the kind of science. We brought in cold cutting equipment in, they put on every first pump in 2012 in Manchester. I thought they called it keyhole surgery of firefighting. I presumed in 10 years' time, this stuff will be absolutely everywhere. Some great YouTube footing online. I can send you to link to it, Pete. So to bring it online, we set fire to a house in either Oldham or Rochdale to bring new tactic. And the new tactic was we'd rock up, we'd thermally scan the building with state-of-the-art thermal scanners, handheld thermal scanners. We then, punch through the door to inject the kind of mist. It was the Cobra kit at the time. Other kits
Cobra system, yeah.
And then we did it in real time. We had all the thermocouples inside, and you could watch the temperature drop like a stone. It went from 900 degrees to 90 in about 30 seconds, and used about a cupful of water or something ridiculously low. A tiny quantity of water. Whack in the door, and stick a PPV on, and you're inside in less than 2 minutes. Probably 90 seconds. It's on tube. It's live on YouTube. The link. Real time, 2 minutes. They put the fire out, and I'm thinking, who in their right mind would want to still go into burning buildings, all the carcinogenic stuff on your fire kit, or flashover, backdraft? I just assumed that in 20 years' time, the fire world would be safe now. How many brigades have taken on just the cold cutting technology?
I know Tyne and Weir did a massive investment into it, but you see, Scotland have got various. I actually saw a really unfortunate video, and again, not because anybody's stupid or incompetent, of just a really bad application of it only a couple of weeks ago. There was someone stood in front of a shop fire. I won't say where it was in the UK. And they were just applying a cold cut system at about 12 feet to a big open window of a shop fire. But again, I think that's the only resource they had there at the time.
It's not
but it is. It's a tool for the toolbox. So people might be listening to this, and I want to push back on the audience's behalf as I go, well, shut up, Steve. What if this savable life? Right, if it's that hot inside there, A, it's not savable life. B, it's a tool in the toolbox. So when we look at the quadrant model, when we speak about offensive exterior, this is a great offensive. This is a great offensive exterior tool. Being able to penetrate into a compartment, because as soon as you open the door, it was back in Braidwood's writings. He would speak anti-ventilation to police officers. He would say a fire grows in direct correlation to the air in which it receives, or its air entrainment. So the irony is with a high rise, and again, there's lots of connections here for Grenfell, although I know people will say, well, cold cut wouldn't have helped us in Grenfell. That's not what we're talking about. We're just talking about it as a principle for a second. When you open the door at any high rise fire, you immediately compromise the ventilation profile. You introduce something. And yes, we've got our smoke blockers and our smoke and all that sort of jazz. Fantastic work. But I've never seen them deployed in high rise though. I know the pressure might be a challenge and being able to produce it.
That was one of those things that need to be developed, because, so the high rise pressure, you need very long drums. You probably need a kind of specialist vehicle with a super long kind of drum of hose.
Or you need a demountable, highly electronic charge
Stick it up
to develop that. To be able to take it internally.
You're right, self-contained tank of water. So there is a possibility, but it needs further development. But to your point, Pete, about research and science, and
we're not doing much of it.
No,
and I just went out and did some smoke cooling experiments in the Netherlands.
That point about savable life. So we brought the fire before we brought it on the run, because we knew we'd be challenged left, right, and centre. We commissioned the Fire Protection Association to do some proper, good quality research on, and they brought in several medical specialists on things like, smoke burns to the lungs, smoke to the trachea, heat burn, etc. So what really happens in superheated steam, etc., etc. So a really good piece of scientific work. And you're absolutely right. The conclusion in simple terms is, if you're in the room that's on fire and it's about 900 degrees C, then the steam could be quite harmful. The chances are, at 800 or 900 degrees C, with the toxic material that's kicked off, you've not survived. I was
going to say the smoke's killed you before the fire or the heat does.
Anywhere else in the building is of benefit. And I always use the example of a kettle boiling. If you put your hand over the spout of a kettle, you'll burn your hand. If you put your hand about that far above the spout of a kettle, you won't, because steam has very, very low kinetic energy. It runs out of energy very, very quickly. So there's a lot of good science that says, but we've just never done it ever. We still rather give it it feels to me we've still only got two tactics. Well, we've only got one, which is kind of pulsing. Is there a second that we use?
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together. No, so that was the point of the research that I was part of in the Netherlands. We've got the bow method and the art method, because we created the pulsing robots. You know, and
we got a couple of guys who talk about this story. Carol Lambert and the guy John McDonough.
Yeah. There's a couple.
What I would say on that, I think Dan said it. If we have a shipping container on fire, we've cracked it. There's nothing can happen in a shipping container.
I just spent some time down in Portsmouth. Yeah, they're great at it. Manchester have done a lot of work around the docks as well. Yeah. They're really good at it.
If it's bricks and mortar, we might struggle a little bit. But if it's a shipping container, we've cracked it. And there's nothing.
They don't mess about on ships. They know they can't get it wrong in the middle of the ocean.
There's not many of them in Lincolnshire. I get it. Training kids is hard. Capability is hard. But they pretending to ourselves. Your earlier point about learning from mistakes. It takes you so far, but it isn't the whole answer. And as long as we kind of get that, I think that's a step forward. I know I completely agree, Pete. There is a really big issue about the science and tactics of firefighting. And I would say Paul Greenwood was absolutely fantastic in this country. Dan does really well. There's a couple of, I'd say, kind of hot fire instructors on the landscape. If you look around the planet, there's probably no more than 20 or 30 people, and you probably had most of them, if not all of them, on your podcast. They get together once a year in an annual conference thing, don't they? The CFPT stuff, and you probably
just did one out in America. Yeah,
there's the guys at what's he called? Lars in
Lars Axelsson. There's also Dave in the UK. Dave's coming on.
There's probably no more than 20. A couple of guys in America who, if you put them together...
Do you think they're healthy disruptors, though? Because I think they are, but obviously I've got a recency bias, and I'm very romantic about it. To most people, there's the approach NIMBY, not in my backyard. Yeah, I think there's a lot of that, because if you speak to any... Let's take Paul as an example. Paul had been in London Fire Brigade, I think, 2 or 3 years, and I might get this wrong, before he started doing international travel and going out going... I'm not the sharpest knife in the drawer, but I'm not sure this makes sense to me. I'm going to go and find... And he must have pissed off, excuse my language, a lot of people saying, what do you know? Get back in your box, finish your development, probie. Do you know what I mean? So you have to have a really healthy disruptor muscle to look at this and go, what? Hang on a minute.
Well, I completely agree. And the second thing that happens, though, and it can happen even better now because of technology, is you find your own tribe. You find the people like you, and you then almost circle the wagons, and it says them lot up there don't get it. So we'll do what we can within our tribe at our level, but that's the best. They almost kind of convince themselves to give up because nobody's listening to that level of disruption.
Yeah.
And in a way, so I've spoken to many of those guys. So with my kind of new role with the Fire Sector Confederation, I've chatted to Dan and several others. I do think there is scope for higher authorities. It was one of the reasons. Sir Martin Bowen's big recommendation for Fire Academy. During Grenfell, we were all asked to submit reports on what we think the recommendations should be that we'd like Sir Martin to consider. All those are available online, Pete. And I made several suggestions. The main one that Sir Martin picked up on was the idea of a fire academy. And
College of Fire,
was my part of this was my thinking that we absolutely do need to bring together, in my view, the best in the world, and we can do it with technology without having to travel all over the world, And they're all smokies, aren't they? They all kind of, you watch them online and they love nothing better than having about 28 hot burns in a day and going on a couple of beers and swinging the lamp.
All going to probably die early,
well, brilliant.
but,
why wouldn't you? Just look at that helmet. How black is that helmet? And there's that kind of cultural paradigm, isn't there? There's nothing wrong with that, but it can also be exclusive as well. And what I think we need to try and do is get that insight and that knowledge. I think Dan is doing some really good challenge about that. I think NFCC is trying to push a bit of this through NOG. Whether NOG's the vehicle is another matter entirely.
I don't think NOG's the vehicle, but I know.
Shoot.
I've just recorded with Phil Garrigan, and it'll probably go out before this goes out. And Phil has an interpretation of this, which I quite like, because when we think of a college of fire, people have this vision of a building like the Fire Service College used to be. And I appreciate the company that owns it now still do a lot of great work, but it is a private organization now. He's talking about centers of excellence. So an example, the tremendous investment that's gone into Manchester Fire and Rescue Service, or the incredible training facility now available at Merseyside and places like this. There becomes I think it's not the Peter principle, the Matthew principle, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I think you'll see these areas where Manchester, Lancashire, Merseyside, West Mids, maybe a few of those larger brigades will continue to the distilling process. They have time, they have capacity. At Manchester, when I was down there recently, Dave Berry, I did a podcast with him. I think they've got 60 staff in their training department. That is just massive. That's like 3 times the size of most other organizations, maybe 6 times the size of a lot of other training departments. And therefore they're making capacity for this incredible research and development. I think where NFCC should try and sit is to bring that together, standardize it, disseminate it across the UK Fire and Rescue Service, but also find some sort of payment scheme whereby you can invite whatever smaller service from the middle of nowhere to Manchester and train its officers there, bring them to the Fire Service College, bring them down to Merseyside, have these centres of excellence. This person is great at, Wales are amazing at wildfires. Manchester might be top on fire behaviour, Merseyside and the USAR capabilities, whatever it might be, trying to come at it from that frame rather than saying, right, we all need to invest to create a college of fire and every service has got to give £10 million. Well, that's never going to happen. It's just it's not realistic. I think that's a reframing of it. And I think Phil has a big appetite for it. I will say that he seems very intentional about it. Whether that manifests, whether it's within his sphere of control, I don't know.
So it's a good one, this, Pete. So I made the recommendation in the first place about this fire. Well, it's a good illustration of how something that started off here then becomes something entirely different over here. And what did
you envisage when you recommended it?
Fire Service College, because it was a mistake to flog it in the first place.
We're never going to get that back, though, are they? Because the government would have to buy it back.
Straight away, you've fallen into, well, we know
Tell me.
That's not a job for Sir Martin Moorbeck. Sir Martin Moorbeck's job was to recommend, on the basis of the evidence in front of him that he saw, what he believed was necessary to secure a better future. It's not up to him to find the money to do it. That's a matter for government. Whether the government accepts it or not is a matter for the government.
But if they refuse it, they have to accept the recommendation.
Yeah. He was surprised that there was no... he's familiar with other sectors, whether it's Sandhurst, the College of Policing, international models, and he was surprised that there was no equivalent in the fire and rescue.
It is baffling when you think about it.
So you're already in that negotiating, compromising space, Pete, because you're in the world. You're right. You're right. Just part your compromise to one side.
The government spends billions on some things that we roll our eyes at every day, and we go, if it's important enough, you'll do it.
So it's a country. We've just blown 385 billion on. I've no idea what we've blown it on. A couple of new roads. So the idea that somehow or other this is an unaffordable prospect for the UK PLC.
It's a victim mindset, isn't it? I've slipped into that again. You're right.
So either Grenfell was a landmark or it wasn't, and it's not for me.
Either we care or we don't. Yeah.
Exactly. In my opinion, it was, and Sir Martin thought that was the case. So just to be clear, he would never write an report. Can you reinvent the Fire Service College, modernise it? Because you shouldn't have flogged it in the first place. I mean,
it's an amazing.
We're on a podcast here, Peter. So. I'm just being honest. That what you asked me, what I had in mind, and what I had in mind was a facility a lot like the college that wasn't crumbling.
I thought of it when I spoke to Phil, like if the government says, oh, you need to make all the fire and rescue service fleet green, and we go, okay, well, an electric fire engine is 4 times the cost of a normal fire engine. I'm happy to do it if you are going to write that off or subsidize it. So if you're saying the same about a college of fire, okay, I don't disagree with you. You can't ask the fire services to pay for it. 80% of their budget goes on their cost, their staff, and we're all getting pay rises.
We're now in the art of the possible. So I don't want to be unhelpful and sit in this land that said, well, that's
You're
a
right.
perfect world.
No,
Nothing.
I agree.
But you know, that's what the inquiry was clear. If you want the UK PLC to be able to present itself to a global, a wider world as a place to do business and be safe and all those things, then you may need to think about the architecture that's in place to support that. Now, we're now in the world of compromise, different governments in power, etc., and there's all kinds of stuff. My NHS that's on, there's no money for that. Chap called Putin and Iran. So we are in the field of compromise. So Phil is quite rightly trying to figure out what is the best that's possible given the restraints that he is working under operations. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Right back to think that's not the same thing as what the inquiry was.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Very different thing.
Right.
So this is the real world, and the inquiry was where it thought it should be. So then on that blended model, again, we've been around this circle a few times over the years. Completely agree with it. I mean, when we built the Meister Training Centre, so just to be clear, there was no, you've covered the sort of Stephen Hunt stuff. It's a terrible tragedy, and there were many reasons behind it. But there was no kind of subsequent HSE stuff. If we're looking at fault and blame, there wasn't a question of people being at fault or blame. I think that probably, and you might think, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? But I genuinely think that was a lessons to be learned situation. And one of the lessons to be learned was things like proper hot fire training. Heat exhaustion was a kind of real issue. And some of the issues about
synthetic smoke and propane is not going to cut it.
And so, although there was comms was another one, kind of radio comms. So, although none of those were criticised as being wrong, that's not the same thing as being right either. That doesn't mean there weren't lessons to be learned. So, right from Stephen's tragedy and before, we were already on a direction of travel about what a modern fire and rescue service needs to have. And in simple terms, when you ain't got many fires in the real world and they're still dangerous, you've only got one choice, and that is to create pretty close facilities to enable people to come as close as realistically possible to the experience they're going to have in the real world.
It really has become beyond diluted. I often use the analogy of the military. Like the military, a tiny, tiny percentage of the military will ever deploy into a conflict zone and action. And I appreciate all of our serving armed personnel, and they're doing a fantastic job when they have to. But just off data, the vast majority of them will never deploy to a conflict zone. And I'm glad of that. I don't want our soldiers going to war unless they absolutely have to, because it's horrific and I know nothing about it. So that having been said, they still train all year round, really big, expensive training facilities and bases, and they do it day in and day out for a thing they will likely never do.
Yeah. That was
even though we've got less fires now, the vast majority of firefighters, once a month, if not once a set, are going to go to a fire.
Yeah. Completely. So a couple of anecdotes to sort of reinforce your point there, Pete. So I remember when I took over as a chief, I did kind of looking at what kit we had, and I went to, it was a very hot summer's day, very unusual in Manchester. It was about 32 degrees outside. We don't get many of them. And so I'm observing our hot fire training capability, and kind of guys came out. So they came outside, and I said to the instructor, I said, so what temperature do we go to on our hot fire training? He said, we got, I think he said 21 degrees or something like that, 20 something degrees. And it was 30 degrees outside. So I said, so I'm hotter stood here today with my t-shirt on, with my shirt on, than they are inside there, and they're doing hot fire training. Is that right? He said, well, yeah. I said, well, do you not think there's something about, this is supposed to be hot fire training, and it's hotter outside than inside. we've got something wrong. That's not hot fire training.
Was that a synthetics that they were doing?
Yeah.
Then, was it?
And then,
I was going to say, because temperatures would be way higher in a...
Well, environmental health boss, we can't do this. And then there's health and safety. And then shortly afterwards, I went to another fire station, and there was a roof on the floor with a little kind of parapet, so about a metre off the floor. And then the roof went up from there. And the watch manager was showing us around, and I said, what's that roof doing on the floor over there? He said, it's for roof training, boss. I said, well, can't be picky and all that, but in the old days, you used to have to go up a ladder, flip it over, and run it up the roof. That's what you had to do to use a roof ladder, and then learn how you get onto the roof, because it's quite dangerous up there. He said, well, yeah, we can't do that now. It's health and safety. I said, it's dangerous. I said, I know. That's why people call the fire brigade, because there's been an emergency. That's what
unnecessary risk during training.
I think, Peter, we've had years and years of, and I know it's like a right Luddite and the old job done, but this is not about punishing people. This is not about putting people in unnecessary danger.
Not bee stings, no.
But if you go all the way back to the first piece of work that the Health and Safety Executive did on training in fire and rescue services, it was done in 1984, 40 years ago. It was called Training for Hazardous Occupations. And it's worth going back and having a read, because it's as real today as it was then. And even the Health and Safety Executive said, if you are putting people in a stressful, difficult and dangerous situation, at the very least, you need to train them to the best you possibly can to prepare them for that real world eventuality. 1984, that was the Health and Safety Executive. And so different fire services are trying to do different things. And I absolutely get the constraints and the various health and safety improvement notes, et cetera, et cetera. And I know it's really hard, but I think there remains a need just to take that step back and say, where is the capability? How do we cluster it? How do we use specialism? How do we make sensible use, whether it's Centre for Excellence or whatever? How do we maximise the total capability we've got within a better framework than we're delivering at the minute?
I want to respect your request. Cycle back. Admiral James Stockdale.
Yeah.
Difficult circumstances, enduring hardship, staying motivated.
So your point earlier, Pete, was about not getting too pessimistic, but there's something about optimism, because without optimism, so there's two expressions. There was a famous Marxist called Antonio Gramsci, who was in prison, and he wrote a really important piece of work, and he talked about the pessimism of the intellect and the optimism of the will. So he talked about people need to be bright enough to understand it's a bit grim, it's a bit bad, but by the same token, have the willpower to be optimistic, to believe there's still opportunity, they can still conquer it. So this idea of this juxtaposition of bad and good, negative and positive, has been around a long time. The one I prefer was a guy called James Stockdale. If anybody reads kind of management books, the guy called John Cotter wrote, was it Good to Great or something? Was that?
No, it was Jim Collins. Jim
Collins, Good to Great. I think it's either in Cotter's book or Jim Collins' book. He gets a mention, but he's written his own book, Admiral Stockdale. Call it the Stockdale Paragraph. So he was the most senior officer of the U.S. Army in the Vietnam War as a captive prisoner of war. He lost a leg. An incredibly brave guy. A really intense story. And he chose to stay a prisoner of war in order to manage the prisoner of war situation in Vietnam. And he used to say, I hate the optimists, because they get locked up and they'll be out by Christmas. He said, and he said, those are the guys I used to really worry about, because they'd have 5 or 6 failed escape attempts, they'd have a terrible time, and then they'd just...
unrealistic expectations.
Literally lose the will to live. And those were the poor guys that are doing suicides or whatever.
They succumb to despair and
give me a rational optimist who says, well, I can get out of here, but I'm not going to do it in 5 minutes. Firstly, I need a smart plan. And secondly, to execute that plan is probably going to take a long time. So if it's digging a hole, just so that it doesn't get noticed, I can only dig that much each day. And if I do any more, I'm going to get found out. So I've got to be really disciplined, really rigorous, and it's going to take me 6 months. So I best get started now, because whenever I start, it's still going to take me 6 months. And that persistence, that resilience, that tenacity, that stickability, that rational optimist constantly believes, and there'll be bad days and good days, but he said they believed they were going to get out. And do you know what? Many of them did. And I kind of love that. In the fire service, and my early point about morale's never been higher than rock bottom, we either talk ourselves into gloom and despondency that there's nothing's possible, or we pour syrup over everything and want it to be absolutely brilliant. And we talk about the guy in the fascio, isn't DRA brilliant? Isn't not brilliant? We struggle out, but I feel that we struggle to find that place in the middle, which is rational optimism that confronts the truth. This isn't great. It's all right. If we want to make it good, we need to do that, and it's going to take us 2 years. So shall we get going now and stick at it?
Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning was a similar element, is that he had to define a purpose for his challenge, define a purpose for his suffering. Like you said, the people that had unrealistic expectations just simply didn't survive. And he was that sort of rational optimist where he reframed his purpose of he was there to tell the story of it. But you also see it in cancer patients where they have to paint a picture of not physically, but like they have to imagine a future that requires them. So they say like plan holidays and plan things for the next few years that's going to require you to be alive. So even though you're facing horrific consequences, you can have some sort of informed, optimistic pessimism, if you will. I know we've gone down a beautiful segue there. Cycle us back to the Grenfell Inquiry. What was it like to be inside those rooms, to be part of those conversations? Because we referenced the Netflix documentary earlier, and I watched it again this morning, and even having watched it 2 or 3 times now, brought me to tears twice. Once was the gentleman speaking about trying to evacuate with his daughter and his wife. And the second was the firefighter we spoke about when he was challenged during the inquiry about why he didn't knock on the door 175. How, as someone that's had so many years, so many decades in this sector, how do you look at that rationally and try to just give us some insights what it's like to be part of something like that? How can you draw anything from it? It is such an enormous topic with so many quote unquote experts piling themselves in with lots of political and we haven't seen many legal consequences, but maybe speak to that as well.
Yeah, so thanks for that, Pete. I'd never done expert witness work before, so when I got asked to do it, I kind of, I had to really think, is this something I can do? Do I have the necessary kind of skills and experience to be able to do that? Because from the outset, when you were chief, I was chief, 17 years, so you read a lot of stuff, you read papers, and you're writing, you don't write a great deal as a chief. And so some of your kind of writing skills, just the ability to present really high quality, well argued propositions, succinct reports, etc. Just that basic skill level is something you need to think about. So I kind of concluded it was really important to get involved. The second thing, the team were very clear from the outset. So the process, people might be curious how you end up doing it. It's not a kind of blackballing job, as it were. I got a phone call from the Director General of the inquiry when he was appointed, who said they are sourcing experts, and he'd contacted various people, NFCC president, they contacted various people, local government association. So they've done a trawl, as any kind of recruitment process would do. They've been given several names, and they were contacting those people to ask if they'd be interested in doing the Grenfell Tower Inquiry as an expert witness. And I'd been suggested as one of those people that might do that. Would it be something that would be of interest? I said, professionally, it would be absolutely fascinating. They said, send us a CV. So I did. And then a couple of weeks later, I got a phone call saying, would you come down and meet Sir Martin and the team and have a chat? So I did. I met them in the Royal Courts of Justice, expecting to have a coffee with Sir Martin. The whole of the team were there. All the Grenfell barristers were there together as the administrative term. And it was they were very pleasant, but I know exactly how people feel to be questioned in the Royal Courts of Justice. At the end of which, and they were straightforward but probing, it's fair to say. At the end of which, I then got a phone call a couple of weeks later saying we'd like to be the expert witness. is that okay? I said, how long will it be? And they originally thought up to 2 or 3 years as a minimum, might be a bit longer, to be 7 in the end. And so I said, well, I committed to seeing it through to the end, whatever length of time that took. So that's just how you get involved in it, Pete. So it's kind of quite a straightforward process.
MSA are supporting us on today's podcast, and I chose to partner with them because I've been wearing this stuff for nearly 20 years, and they are the global leader in development, manufacture, and supply of incredible, safe products that really protect people, not just our communities out there, but also first responders, most importantly, all over the world. Get yourself over to MSA and have a look at it. The high-performance protective clothing for emergency services responders. They also partner with us on the UK Pink Firefighters. That's because we love them. The helmets with the reflective visor, the F1XF, absolutely epic helmet. And not forgetting how they improve firefighter safety through their connectivity in the connected firefighter platform. MSA are always pushing the envelope, and it's a real privilege to be able to continue to grow our partnership together. So whether it's your PPE, your bunker gear, your helmets, your SCBA, your thermal imaging, your Luna, or your portable gas detection, both of us know that this equipment needs to work. It needs to be high quality, reliable, and dependable in the moment. And that's why I use MSA, because they know what's at stake.
From the outset, you also sign various documents and where you are clear about your duties and legal obligations, and those are to give your opinion, professional opinion, genuinely without fear or favour. So if you think what an organisation did was wrong, you need to be clear that this is binary. There's good and bad. Yeah. It's not a learning exercise. This is a public inquiry, so it's binary. And you need where your point of view either changes on the basis of evidence or contradicts, then you've still got an obligation to be honest and straightforward. And and essentially, they were honest from the outset. You're unlikely to win over many people from your previous life.
Yeah.
So you probably don't want to be expecting many invites to Christmas parties, or Santa's probably not going to be knocking your door. But to be fair, I didn't have many before I retired. That wasn't necessarily
okay.
Disaster thought. So from the outset, I can genuinely say, and I do Grenfell sessions for fire service, and I say the same thing. Sir Martin Moorbeek is a genuinely one of the nicest blokes you're going to meet, and one of the smartest blokes you're ever going to meet. The ability for that guy to process information is absolutely off the scale.
When you meet people like that, it is just like another species.
I mean, some people are born to be judges, and Sir Martin was, born to be a judge. They say, I never saw him lose his composure once, even when some people, there's a good Netflix clip where Lord Pickles, I think, tested Sir Martin's composure in the way he kind of conducted himself in a couple of hearings. I never ever...
when he walks in and he's like, I'm a really important person. I've not got very much time for this today. Please choose your time. And I was like, what a dick. What a way to start. Bloody hell, mate.
I don't think the only person that thought that. And even
I was like, really? Really?
I was there.
More important things to do than this.
Yeah. Lord Pickles is sort of spads are kind of, so anybody asked for a break anytime and they got it, whether it was with the operational crews, Lord Pickles, Iconic. If people asked for a break, they got one. And on that occasion, I think Lord Pickles' advisors realised it probably wasn't the wisest way to open a session like that. Anyway, so Sir Martin, if you remember at the start, Peter, very controversial character. What does this kind of guy, a pillar of the establishment, know about this? And understandably controversial. Roll that throughout every day of the inquiry. There were members of the victims' families in the inquiry hearing rooms, and after a relatively short period of time, on most days, if not all days, they'd bring Sir Martin either a kind of a cupcake or bake something for him. So they got to sort of know Sir Martin.
An affinity for him, yeah.
So I'll be surprised if you've heard a single criticism of Sir Martin Moorbeek since the publication of the report, including from the victims' families. Contrast that with the start of this 7 years ago, and I think that's a genuine testament. And I have no reason to say this. I've got a friend of mine, Sir Martin, and actually I didn't have masses to do with him because he's the chair of the inquiry. I worked through the barristers.
Yeah, you're not going for dinner every night or anything like that.
No, genuinely nice guy. very composed, unbelievably smart, reflective, and I would say this finally, Pete, not a single day, not one single day passed in all 7 years where some member of the team didn't remind me what we're doing this for. And we're doing this to make sure that the 72 people that died at the Grenfell Tower fire understand what happened and why. That's not the same thing as justice. Justice, that's truth. This is about getting to the truth. Justice is another matter entirely.
72, not 96.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
Jesus, what a ball drop.
The inquiry's job isn't to dispense justice, it's to get to the truth. And the fact that Sir Martin has not been criticised by any of the victims' families, I would suggest it bears testament to the fact that he's absolutely got to the truth. So it's been a really intellectually stimulating, but a genuinely rewarding thing, Peter, because at the end of the day, all you can do is get the truth exposed. And our final thing I'll say, I suppose, on that point is on the Netflix inquiry. Everything on the Netflix thing, the Grenfell thing was known. And in fact, what I was but I was content that all the sessions that I've done on Grenfell pretty much focused on the same sensitive areas, I guess, as the Netflix inquiry.
Side note, you must have to put a lot on hold in your life when you do that. Do you have to move down to London and stay there for months on end, or?
No, well, we did through COVID. So the first phase, remember the first phase was 2018.
Oh, yeah.
June to October 2018. So I would go down for a couple of 3 days. So the inquiry kicks off about 10, finished about 4. They have a break in the middle, and that's the working day. And remember, there was a fabulous podcast by a lady called Kate Lamble that was produced at the end of every day. So for certainly for the first few weeks, I was there for most days. So Mike Dowden's evidence, who I thought was a very impressive individual, by the way, I thought very, very acquitted himself, I thought, extremely well. So I was there for all of Mike Dowden's evidence, and I'd say the majority of the key witnesses in the early days. I would then catch up, because it was on YouTube, I could catch up at night at home online. I listened to Kate Lamble's podcast, but I thought they were a superb summary.
She did great, didn't she? I met her at a high-rise conference a while ago.
Absolutely, tremendous journalist. And she got, I don't know if you know, she got made redundant on the day the final report was published by the BBC.
Doesn't surprise me.
And so, and then at weekends, I'd kind of catch up on any YouTube footage of any evidence that I'd kind of missed. I visited the tower on 7 separate occasions. I was observed when the water expert did his tests with the London Fire Brigade. So I tried my hardest to immerse myself in what it would have been like on the night. You know, I went up and down the tower in PPE, not pretending that it's the same as being in a BA set and all the rest of it, but just, I suppose, to ground truth everything. I walked the area. So yeah, seven times I was at the tower and spent. So yeah, it was quite full on for the first year, for the first evidence, and then, you know, like when the team put the report together, helping do that, and then my actual evidence came in phase 2. And so again, you're right, Pete, lock yourself away. So how that works is the call for evidence. So there's specific terms of reference, what the inquiry is looking at, and after phase 1, Sir Martin was clear. There were things that he could make a decision about in phase 1 that he probably hadn't expected to. So my terms of reference shrank a little bit for phase 2. So I got issued new terms of reference, what they wanted me to look at in phase 2 and produce a report on. So I got very specific terms of reference to produce a report on the efficacy of the firefighting tactics, the efficacy of the approach to 7.2, what, you know, the 5 or 6 things. And then you have a confidential evidence pot. So they call them a Reg 9 notice. So the inquiry team writes to LFB and others and say, give us every bit of evidence you've got on breathing apparatus checks or training or whatever. And you just get a massive information. So my pot had 14,000 separate records in my confidential database. So you review all of that lot, you figure
out an aid.
No, it's
Jesus.
No, and then you kind of work through all of that lot, and you then write your report with your findings. That then report got sent to all the core participants in the January of 2021. The reason why that's important is it's possible. So where I said the LFB did or didn't do A, B, or C, and I think that's a material weakness or a material failing or a significant weakness. That's the kind of language that you'd use. I found no evidence to support this, or I found no evidence of the other. The LFB still had, between the January of 2021 and when the hearings themselves were held, which was in the October time, September, October, November, to produce any evidence that I'd missed. So there was still an
Down to that, yeah.
time, yeah. So and so I then gave oral evidence against that report alongside all the other witnesses called in that module, which was module 5, firefighting. And then once you essentially it's kind of done then, and really I would observe the rest for the last couple of years, and then the only thing that you do, you keep a watching brief. And if there's some query, because all the experts have their own expertise, but
Call you back in, yeah.
you know, if an engineering expert said, well, they could have done, the water expert said, for example, you know, a branch would reach the top of the tower in theory, and I've got all the data, blah, blah, blah. And they'd say, well, is that right? You'd say, well, if you're only doing one branch, it might be. But when you've got 6 overrunning and the crew, so you could then put an operational overlay on some of the, that doesn't mean that the reports themselves would be changed. That's the water expert's report, or that's the comms expert's report. But it's all there for Sir Martin to weigh in the balance. And remember, Pete, Martin's job as experts, you're encouraged not in any way to try and come down on one side or the other. That's not your job. And actually, it's not only okay that experts can disagree, it's probably good that they should. You know, a very early point you were saying, isn't it complex firefighting? Yes, it is. So there isn't a straightforward answer to some of this stuff.
No.
I guess the final thing I'd say, so it was absolutely fascinating, Pete. And then in this process, constant questions from, they call them the BSRs, bereaved survivors and relatives, barristers and lawyers, where they felt my report hadn't gone deep enough, or they got further questions. We talked that through, and if I needed to do an addendum to my report because they'd asked some questions that hadn't been covered in my report, or the team felt needed to be covered in my report. So it's a very iterative process to get to a final report. My draft report started at 480 pages and it finished at, I think, 90 something, including a CV. And that wasn't the team. That was my decision. So where I would say X, Y, and Z, they'd say, well, that's entirely fine, but we have covered that quite a lot in phase 1 already. So do you want to make sure you're not repeating what we've already done? And secondly, what's your base of saying that? If that's your opinion based upon your experience, that's fine. Say that. But if you've got some evidence to say, actually, the policy is this, or history suggests we've done that, then, you know, we'd welcome seeing what that evidence is. Not for us, because there's 628 core participants, I think there was in Grenfell. Every one of them had a barrister, and every one of those barristers and core participants has a right to challenge what it is you say. So it's a good idea to have some evidence for saying it if you possibly can.
Yeah.
But if you don't, that's up to you. Just prepared for a difficult challenge. And I said there were probably 2 areas where I think that ended up being the case. One of the big questions I got asked was, you mentioned flat 175. There were several others where the firefighter was sent on, let's say, a mission, a clear mission with a clear brief, and they encountered people in the staircase in terrible states of distress, and in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, they turned around and brought the casualty out that they'd found on the staircase. And the fundamental question was, is that what they should have done? What was the rule? What was the policy? What's the guidance say what they should have? If you've lost a loved one in one of those flats where your crews have been sent, then you've got a really understandable.
That's a good question as to whether or not that's written down anywhere, because, you know, we come across savable life, then we save savable life.
But that's a bit of a kind of, what does that mean? It's almost a...
Exactly, yeah, that's what I'm saying. What's the metric? What's the... Yeah, it's a very...
What does that mean? It's only after the event. Well, if you saved a life, it was savable. If you didn't, it wasn't. What does... So this is the thing I'd say about NOG, Peter, and the guidance. I think there's a misconception that the architecture that's in place protects decision makers on the ground. I would caution against that belief. The inquiry is interested. What does your brigade's policy say? They're not really to what NOG said. NOG is the background for how you decided what your policy was in your organisation.
It's the broad brushstrokes, and their word is in guidance.
What's your policy, and where did you get it from? Because you're the chief, you're the employer, you've got responsibility for this firefighter. And to say, well, I was following the NOG, well...
So before I hit them with a stick, you show me that they deviated from something you wrote down.
Well, the next question is, so did you agree with the NOG when it came out? So where is there any evidence that you either agreed or... And it goes right back to...
You formally wrote that we were going to adopt this.
It goes right back to your earlier point about science, Peter, doesn't it? So, because NOG is only a kind of headline, despite a highway code, it's expressed in very high-level terms of hazards and control measures.
Yeah.
I think another good example. Sir Martin was concerned, this is in my report, about how many people seemingly... if I said did their own thing, I don't mean that to be a casual or sort of not caring, but they were acting without any command and control. Or
where were they self-deploying outside of operational context? Yeah.
And Sir Martin's view was, well, there's a fine line. An incident like this was going to always entail a lot of improvisation.
Absolutely.
But actually, to what level had the LFB, but the sector, anticipated an incident like this, given what's gone before, namely Lacanau, Shirley Towers, etc. So this can't have come a complete shock to you. So how had you prepared people for this eventuality? So where's the line between people improvising and where could they rely upon what they'd already been trained in, etc.? And there's clearly a gap there. And so he asked me to look at how do people train to use initiative? And there's no training course in how to use your initiative. Please point me to it. And the only place I could find where it even uses the word initiative, I'll come back to the manual of firemanship again. Excuse the gender specific. No two fires are unique. But it then goes on to say a firefighter must enter, or if necessary break into. They need to kind of, a firefighter must be able to improvise on the spur of the moment because they're in an unpredictable setting. Blah, blah, blah. It's worth looking again at that. But it then goes on to say a firefighter must possess initiative. That is the only place where I could find it written down. When I come to NOG, the closest I could find was the hazard is a breakdown of leadership on the incident ground, leading to a breakdown in followership. I have absolutely no idea what that means. That is just management gobbledygook.
Is that mutiny? Are we saying Steve's my instant commander, he's incompetent, I'm taking over?
Yeah, there's some
I'm going to just deviate from his tactical instruction altogether.
You bang on. I remember having some discussions with it.
Well, I suppose the discussion is, I always say to people, when you go through the door, I've got no idea what you're doing. I gave you a bit of a brief from the information and situational awareness I had outside and said, I think go in there. Stairs are on your left, go up, apparently bedroom's on your right. I'll say it in a bit more of a formal manner. But if you go in there and you go, bloody hell, gaffer, fire's in the front room and I can see the casualty on the floor, I don't want you to walk blindly past all of that and go upstairs. I want you to use your intuition.
So is that a breakdown in fellowship, or did they just not follow instruction properly? This is the point about it. We got into kind of management waffly language, and then the control measure is an effective communication strategy. What does that mean? It's just, from a NOG point of view, they're not wrong, are they? But it's a bit like saying, if you smack your car on a dark winter's night, the control measures break down because you didn't pay enough attention to the road. This is just words, aren't they, Pete? So from an inquiry point of view, coming back to kind of where does NOG sit in that context? Insofar as it goes, it's all right. But I don't think it is what people believe it to be. It is not the kind of security blanket, the Harry Potter invisibility shield that you could hold up at a future public inquiry. What they're interested in, so what was the instruction in Greater Manchester or the London Fire Brigade or the West Midlands? What did you expect people to actually do when confronted with that situation? And had you anticipated something like that situation? Bearing in mind, it's happened before. at Lacanal, at Shirley Tower,
Yeah,
and now
that's
at
the
Grenfell.
uncomfortable bit, isn't it?
Yeah, so and it comes right back to your point of have we learning, Pete? And so it was absolutely fascinating to be really pushed into, well, where does it come from, this initiative? What is it? What does it mean?
So, three threads I want to pull on there, and I'm wondering which one to go for first. We mentioned Mike Dowden. From having seen it yourself firsthand, how do you think we prepare our staff to be scrutinized and interrogated under those types of situations? Talk about learnings. What would you think we should do differently to prepare people? Because again, let's totally detach ourselves from Grenfell for a moment. A fire officer will stand in front of somebody and go, I did what I was trained to do. Here's where I think my training is. And then when the problem is, and someone challenging that gets into the third and fourth why around, well, where did that come from? And what were you told to do? That person is going to, I would, not be able to accurately answer that question because I don't think I was adequately prepared by the organisation I work for.
It's a tricky one, that, Pete. So I suppose I'd push back a little bit on the idea of unfair or unrealistically hard questioning. So I sat there for all 3.5, and I show a clip of Mike on when I do a kind of bit of training. He had at least 20 breaks, did Mike. His evidence was 3.5 days, and perfectly understandably, got emotional on several occasions and asked for a break, and was given a break without asking on multiple, at least 20 over the 3 days. And so the questions were, and by all means, I can share some footage if that would find you kind of make the point, because short of not asking a question at all, I generally don't think how questioning could be done any more empathetic.
We need to ask the questions, but are our organisations preparing these people?
The 72 people families happen here, and you're a public servant, and a legitimate question to ask: did these people need to die? So the first question is: so what did you see when you got there, and what were your first thoughts, and what did you do? That's it. I'm not so sure. And actually, the next question is: and what did you do next? And then why did you do that? And was there anything else you thought of that you might have been able to do? This is not hard.
Yeah, but the gravity of that situation and the context and the how unfamiliar anyone would be with that environment.
Preparation bit, that was phase one, and all the witnesses, that was phase one. Phase two is a different matter. These are the kind of folks with scrambled egg on their shoulders. And I think that's a very, very different level of questioning, where you are being held to account about, well, why weren't these firefighters trained? Why wasn't the policy good enough? I think
there's an uncomfortable bit in the Netflix thing where they question Danny around how many people have seen this training. And she's like, I think I remember rightly, she said, I haven't seen it. I wasn't aware of it. I don't know why it was kept to a certain level. Maybe delve into that in a minute.
So if you've got a job title that looks like you should have done something about that, you're going to get serious probing in the second phase. Come back to the first phase. I think it comes back to, I'm not sure you can prepare people, actually, Peter. The fact is, as a public leader now, the moment you rock out those doors, you're being filmed. Whether it's CCTV, or probably body cam in some organisations now, you're certainly on a camera when you get there, aren't you? So there's absolutely no escaping. You are now, there's nothing that you would do as a frontline commander that's not been immortalised digitally forever. So if something goes badly wrong, and it doesn't even need to be at Grenfell, the one last year where there was an old gentleman who kind of run his car into deep water. I think it was about last year.
Yeah, water rescue and operational discretion the kind of is a very sticky thing.
On the rail, sort of looking probably really unfair. What he was presented as looking on in an almost nonchalant manner. Meanwhile, this young guy in waders went in to help out this old guy up to his chest in water in his 70s. So it actually doesn't even need to be a Grenfell, let's say.
It didn't look good.
Well, that kind of for that level of scrutiny. And so if you're in a position of authority, I think you need to expect the chance of you being called to account, whether it's in a public inquiry, an inquest, the media, the court of public opinion are now high. And if that's not your bag, you really might want to think about whether leadership is for you.
It is beyond a privilege to be able to bring the Firefighters podcast to you, and we are so grateful for every single person that supports, listens, shares, and follows our journey. But here's the honest truth. It takes a colossal amount of time and work to keep the podcast going. And to help us keep doing it, create more, reach more guests internationally, and make the podcast sustainable, we're asking for you to help. And to do this, we've set up a Patreon page. Now, by joining this, you'll not only support the future of the podcast, but also gain access to exclusive benefits. Now, if you've ever wanted to meet a member of the podcast, buy us a beer, buy us a coffee, and you think anything you've ever listened to on the podcast has been worth £3, that's basically what we're asking you for. By joining our Patreon community, you will get access to every single full episode archive we have ever made. Now, hundreds and hundreds of key documents that we've got in there on fire behavior, firefighter health, cancer risks, incident debriefs, and so much more. A growing collection of valuable resources to help you learn and grow. Your support in whatever way, dropping it in the WhatsApp group, sharing it on the local newsletter, whatever it is, it's incredibly valuable, and we really do support it, and we need it to make it a long-lasting resource, that legacy resource we always talk about for first responders, firefighters, and everybody everywhere who's ever been interested in joining the fire service. Now, if you're already supporting something, as many people do, it's totally cool. You can still access the podcast for free, and you'll always be able to access all the new episodes for free, but we're asking for your help to make this sustainable. And we want to keep growing, we want to keep sharing the insights, and we want to keep showcasing the incredible work happening in our community and our sector. So if you feel like you want to join the Patreon crew and help us make this possible, head to patreon.com/TFFPC or check the link in any episode podcast notes.
I quite often get asked about, what about the psychological safety of the crews concerned? So there were absolutely counselling facilities for witnesses and so on. But I would also remind people the 72 families sat there whose families did nothing wrong. And they've got a right to know what happened to the people they loved. And they've got a right to expect that people in the public sector
charged with protecting or rescuing them. Yeah.
Things like Nolan principles, the kind of public service ethos that we expect, are prepared to account for the decisions that were made. And all I suggest, Pete, is I would encourage me not to get frightened, because I can genuinely say the inquiry, every lawyer I encountered in the inquiry was absolutely trying to give people the benefit of the doubt. And if they felt somebody had almost kind of dropped themselves in it, so to speak, to use a kind of colloquialism, they would ask them further questions to try and give them a way out, to make sure they'd not just inadvertently stumbled because it's a nervous setting. I can honestly say I saw that on so many times, and I'd really urge people to go back and look at Mike's evidence and just say that wasn't hard-nosed. And I'd also look at Mike Dowden's response, which I come back to the point was professional, authentic, honest. And then if you read the report, notwithstanding Mike accepted responsibility for many aspects of Grenfell, you might argue he probably accepted responsibilities that maybe weren't his to accept. Yeah. But actually, if you then go and read the report, Sir Martin goes as far as he can, given that acceptance, to say Mike Dowden was out of his depth for way too long, by his own admission. He had every right to expect that when more senior officers arrived, they took responsibility from him and gave him the support he had a right to expect, and they didn't. That is absolutely clear in Sir Martin. That's not my words, by the way. It's Sir Martin's report. So
change gears into that next level of leadership, and without naming names, the challenges that were presented, because at some point everyone needs to take a bit of responsibility off the table. But I do also want to ask you around the structure of the inquiry and the heavy focus that was placed on the emergency services. I think the blame for emergency services ran away with itself a little bit, because that was the start of the story and the inquiry, and I feel like the public gave a lot of focus to that. So two questions there. When we move through those levels of seniority, when we say about, how many crews were given this training about cladding and high-rise buildings, and just shine a light, if you can, in the most professional manner as you feel possible, the failures. Let's try and wade through a little bit of this. What were some of the learnings that we really should have taken or should have done better?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of learning for senior management, and I spoke with the benefit of hindsight, Pete. I think I'd be a different chief. I mean, if I'd done Grenfell before, I mean, I was always a pain in the backside as a chief anyway. So I actually read my papers, and I would always say, well, what does this actually mean? You know, I think as we bring forward new policies, we should test them to destruction. And actually, the people at the top shouldn't just kind of go along and say, has it got an equality impact assessment? And I absolutely get kind of culture change, EDI agenda, etc. But
does it still do the thing?
It neutralizes, doesn't it? It creates an idea. Everything needs to be softened, and everything needs to be almost made more gentle and made more palatable and companionable and inclusive. Whatever expression you want to use. And I'm not suggesting the reverse is true. We should go back to any kind of command and control, but there is that place in the middle where it is a dangerous job with big health and safety and risk.
Mission creep, organizational drift.
Yep. And the people paid more at the top are paid more for a reason. And it's expected that they will exercise what I call two things: intellectual curiosity, i.e., they shall say, well, wait a second, that might be what the policy says, but what does that mean? And what's everybody else doing? And the second thing is professional curiosity, which circles us right back to some of that science, Pete, that says,
do you believe that to be true, or have you tested it?
And
do you know it to be true?
Exactly. They know enough about what should be true to test that policy. So it's all fine and dandy to have this new high-rise policy. You don't wear BA above a certain, you know, that whole contestable policy.
Yeah, that was.
Well, you need to be able to argue, is that right? Because if challenged by a trade union or somebody, what's your basis for digging in? If you're just being obstinate because you've got to a kind of odds and end world, that's not good either. So if you've got a belief that this is the right thing to do, kind of, if the union wants to challenge that, or challenge, you know, absolutely, you want this tested to make sure that you've got as close to rightness as you possibly can. Recognize it's complicated. So I think the learnings for senior managers are to be more probing and to be more rigorous in their, but not confrontational, but more rigorous in their challenge to thinking of policy, strategic thinking, etc. And I get, so, and I suppose the other challenge I'd say for those guys is they are consumed, for guys and girls as well, of course, they are consumed with a whole agenda that's nothing to do with this. You know,
information overload.
Yeah, the inspectorate agenda doesn't currently put a higher value on some of this stuff. It's not clear, other than have you all bought your kind of small cuds and all the rest? Aside from signing off the recommendations, it's not clear to me, but I'm not that close to it. I might be wrong. The extent to which they're learning from Grenfell, which is the black box thinking. The first report was 800 pages of some really, really detailed analysis of what went wrong. And there hasn't been any work that's really picked up. What everyone's done is to implement the recommendations. And that's fine, but it's more than smoke HUD's policies. It's more than that. Phase 2, 1,700 pages of reports. There's the odd recommendation for fire and rescue services, but essentially the focus is on the academy. Then very few people will have read the 1,700 page report. It's very hard to read. And that step back, that intellectual step back that says, what the hell does all this mean to the direct travel fire and rescue services for this kind of country, as it were? And so, but it's really hard, Pete, because really.
And I think since then we've been bogged down with so much cultural stuff which has come out as well.
Yeah, and you know,
rightfully so in ways.
Yeah,
you know, some people have gone through some horrific things, but it's a bit like, what are you optimizing for? They're both. They can't both.
When you have these conversations,
they both are priorities.
This is the world we live in. If you sort of, in any way, suggest that you're not pro ED&I, then you must be a racist, bigot, and a Luddite, mustn't you? There's this extreme thing, isn't there? I think
the pendulum swings, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I walked in Pride for 20 odd years. You know, I as it goes for readers or listeners to you, I am straight. It doesn't really matter one way or the other. But I felt it was really important for people not to have to hide behind anything simply because of their sexuality. You know, we changed things like the appointment and promotion regulations. Now, I know we're a long way to go, but the very fact that we've got some fabulous female officers and senior
Loads of great ones.
required some structural changes around regulation. So I kind of think I did my bit during the years to leverage change. We've still got a massive mountain to climb. I get it, but trust me, 10 years in the NHS, they've not cracked it yet either. And so I'm missing the organisation that's really nailed this, whether it's the police, the military. Where is it? Isn't this just society? Isn't society got huge problems with racism, misogyny? And I'm not suggesting that means we should be complacent or it should in any way dim our intention to do better. But actually, at the Grenfell Tower inquiry, the public were not remotely interested in whether it was a female or a male firefighter that did that job. They were a firefighter. Do you know what I mean? That's the important thing as far as the public is concerned. Did they know what they should have been doing, and did they do it, and were they trained to do it? That's really it when you come down to it.
That's that's the bit, and it is uncomfortable. And I heard you tiptoe your way through that, and I feel the same. People know they've listened to the podcast. We do a lot of work, a lot of conversation to bring light to all of these crucial areas to ensure people can show up at work as their best self and they have equity and equal opportunities and all that sort of stuff. I think we've done a lot of the good heavy lifting in that. We've moved some big pillars, echoing back to good to great. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think we're looking for good to great now. I think there is pathways to leadership and there is inclusive workspaces and there's lots more to be done. But the problem is the public, until they go through inquiries like Grenfell, when it comes to firefighting and operational effectiveness, the public doesn't know what good looks like. They haven't got a clue. We know how little research and development and advancement and learning from things has truly happened or not happened. But at the end of the day, they all go out. There is no fire still burning now.
Yeah.
Eventually they become a fuel controlled fire and they burn themselves out. And most of the time we'll clap and say the first responders, the firefighters did as best they can. And I believe on the front line, they are doing the best that they can. And
I agree.
I'll need someone to unpick this for me when they listen back. But I'm like, let's not forget what we're here to do. That's all I'm asking. I'm a knuckle tracking firefighter. I have a lot of great friends of all sorts of backgrounds, and I don't really care where they come from, but I want us to be really good at the thing, and I want us to be proud of that.
Yeah.
As well. And in most places, we are still very good at it, but it's such an evolving sector.
Yeah.
There's some wicked problems, whether it's EV or flooding or environmental change or the landscape of lived accommodation and high rise and all of that. We can't be great at everything, and we need to really pick what we want to optimize for.
Your expression there, Pete. I mean, we're two white men talking here, so that
I know.
itself.
Yeah, we're in a slight echo chamber unknowingly.
And so I think it's right to be conscious of that. But by the same token, that doesn't mean we've no legitimacy to have a conversation about it. Because I think we need to do.
Yeah, I hate myself for apologising sometimes before I bring up a point. Like I need to overlay this with a caveat of apology. I was born a white male. I'm sorry.
Yeah, exactly.
I do have a lot of unseen privilege.
Yeah,
I have a lot of unseen privilege. I get it.
Yeah.
But also, and I say this, we're going to go off on a tangent for a second. When I said this when I was at the Blue Light Show the other day, someone spoke about opportunities for other individuals, and they said, "Oh, there's more male." Talk about gender pay gap. We're way off topic here. We'll come back in a minute. But someone said about the gender pay gap, and they said, "Oh, there's more males in leadership positions." I said, "Yeah, there's also more males kill themselves. There's also more males in prison. There's also more males in low-skilled work. How many female bin collectors do you see?" I said, I'm not pushing back. People know all the goddamn work I do with women in the fire service, and I love that. But I'm just saying, don't weaponize this to take our eye off the ball of trying to be better firefighters.
And by the way, don't overcorrect the playing field, because women didn't ask you to. All they asked for is fairness. The problem, this is not rocket science. I think the problem is, let's call it out. It's bog standard bullying, harassment.
Yeah, there's bullies there. There's knobheads. You'll always get a few bad apples through.
Unconscious bias training. I've genuinely never met an unconscious racist ever. They
know what they're doing.
They normally have kind of, police cut here tattooed around the neck and, Union Jack. They know that.
You go, oh shit, we let one of them through by accident.
They're fairly spottable, aren't they, in most cases? And they're normally shouting some form of abusive remark. So they're not really well concealed. So, so if we sheep dip everybody in unconscious, but there is unconscious bias training, but it's not, it isn't what at the core of what we need is.
And when you say it to the next generation of firefighters, they literally speak in French to them. You speak to people that have grown up in multicultural societies,
completely,
and they go, and we go, look, don't be racist, don't be sexist, and they go, what? Why would I do that? You know, and I'm not saying all the old firefighters are the problem and they're all leaving, but we are going through a massive retirement and recruitment process now across all the fire and rescue service. And what I don't want to do is spend the first 3 weeks of their induction talking all about inclusivity, and then they go, I thought I was going to be a firefighter.
So I always,
I'm probably going to have to apologize for this. Let's get off this topic soon.
Be it. The problem you've got is, if you are inclusive, you don't have to keep telling everybody, you just are. It's so being.
When I go to all these conferences, you see the same faces all the time because you're preaching to the choir. You're pushing on an open door with a lot of the people that go to these things. They're often the people that don't need to go to them, and it's, you know.
Well, coming back to the operational bit, Pete, because I think it does directly play out. There was a really good piece of research done in Holland at the Dutch Fire Academy about culture and its relationship to some of this kind of operational stuff. And in particular, it looked at, because they got kind of two-tier entry, graduate entry and things in Holland.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
And you know, you can dig it out if you like. I think you had
Ricardo Weaver.
Sorry, Ricardo on your podcast. I think
he introduced me to a woman when I was over there who'd done this research. I think it was about banter as well.
Yeah. And what those people, all they're asking for is the right training. They like to be good at the job. They want to have the basic skills. It is the same issue. I think conflating or over prioritizing a sort of ethereal thing of culture change on top of everything else is understandable. But the risk you've gone is that it's somehow different. Actually, if you've got a watch manager who can't make a decision on a fire station about whether to discipline somebody because they're a bully or do something about it or turn a blind eye, they're going to do exactly the same on a job. If they see some sloppy behaviour, they're going to, if they let stuff go on a fire station, they'll let
it's a character trait.
Yeah.
They're passive.
If they don't let it go on a job, the chances are they won't let it go on a fire station either. It is the same. Yeah. It's the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
You want people in leadership, you want people with character. You want people with values. You want people who are smart enough to realise it's complicated. They're prepared to learn. They don't know it all, but they're also got the courage to step forward and take decisions, even with incomplete knowledge, and the humility to realise they might be wrong, but standing around is better than, you know, is the alternative.
I worry that we are going from, you spoke about risk aversion earlier. I think sometimes I worry about timid firefighters becoming timid managers, becoming passive or complacent or timid senior leaders that will follow on in an echo chamber whilst also singing the hypocrisy of, how come nothing's changing?
Yeah.
Well, because also maybe you could just continue, you swallowed half the pill of inclusivity and diversity, but what you actually ended up doing was promoting more people who look and sound a bit different than you, but still think exactly the same. You only swallowed half the pill. The beauty of diversity, and when I go to AFTA or Women in the Fire Service, something like that, the beauty of those environments is these people have a different way of thinking based on a different upbringing and a different life experience. But that can also come from a white male who, you know, you and I didn't grow up the same.
Yeah. And what I'm looking for, Pete, you mentioned him earlier. Just 2 seconds. You mentioned Matthew Said.
Rebel Ideas. Yes, sir.
In a sense, his proposition, he uses the example of 911, doesn't he, where the CIA didn't have a single Arabic speaker in the whole of the CIA. And there's good diversity, but all the men and women and white and black people were American, Ivy League. So they may have looked different superficially, and in many respects were, but the problem wasn't that. The problem was none of them spoke Arabic or read the Quran or whatever. And that's what, there was plenty of signals about 911. So his fundamental proposition is, as characteristic diversity is absolutely important, but it's only as important also as cognitive diversity.
Cognitive diversity. That's what we're missing, mate.
You're disruptive. In the fire service, if somebody sort of disrupts, everyone goes, oh, oh my God, he said something against us. And so we need to welcome that. We need to sort of, what's the minute?
Yeah.
Crack on, do a bit of disruption. It's without disruption and without difference, we have absolutely no progress whatsoever. And so I think trammeling everybody down the same tram lines has an operational.
Yeah.
And the
Feed them through the same sausage machine and then going, I can't believe we've got another sausage.
More accurate.
Well, yeah, of course you've got another bloody sausage.
Isn't it? Dan will have said the same thing, really. When in doubt, put some of the wet stuff on the orange stuff, and you're not going to go far wrong. There's very, very little damage you can do by squirting a bit of water. When you want a bit of thinking time, just squirt some bloody water. The worst you can do is you might start putting the fire out at some point in time. That's the absolute worst you can do. So do you want to start doing that? Instead of thinking about, 2.5 hours later, now's the time to kind of get some water.
Yeah.
I'd analogize that to management. It's not that complicated, Pete. If you got a bully, deal with them, and they're not hard to spot. If you've got racism, deal with it. And actually, culturally, you need to create the right values where it's obvious this organisation has no place for a racist, a bully, a misogynist. We just don't. And so I wouldn't shirk that either. Ultimately, don't keep persevering with people in the hope that one day they might come good. It's unlikely.
Yeah, you can train a skill set, train in a mindset, or training a character trait is nigh on impossible sometimes, I think.
I never had that experience. And it's this idea, if you keep going with enough training, development, CPD, if you just keep going, then everybody can come good. And it's only a question of time. Firstly, I've not found any research at all that suggests that is actually correct as an understanding of the situation. But B, we are paid from the public with purse, resources are tight, and there is a limit to which the public would expect us to keep persevering because actually our wages are paid from the public purse. And sometimes you just have to reach a point where you say, it's not working for both of us, is it? I'm
going to write that one off.
It might sound like a bit of a negative blind alley, but I don't, what you permit, you promote. If you struggle organisationally to deal with people's behaviour, bad behaviour, or it's in a grey area how you view it, get it out of the grey area. Bad behaviour, bad. Good behaviour, good. Don't get yourself in the middle.
I want to be respectful of our time, but I want to take a hard left turn. We spoke about technology before we started our discussion today, and maybe a framework slipstream into this is, we spoke about how much information gets bombarded into organizations now. I always say, we are drowning in information, starved of wisdom. And you were speaking about technology and utilizing that more in the way that we work in our organizations. Unfold that for me.
Yeah, so I'm kind of bought into the idea of AI an awful lot. You could lose your will to live on AI, but
I use it a lot.
Yeah, so do I. Grok, Chat, GPT, the various. So we're doing a lot of work with the Confederation using AI around fire research and what have you. In fact, we've got a bid in for some funding to try and make better sense of fire research. We've struggled with this for many years, using an AI in a way it's not done before. So wherever you sit on this spectrum, you're the evangelists that think, tomorrow it'll all be here, and there are people over here that think it's massively overblown, and we're kind of somewhere in the middle. But all of the good stuff that you read, the sensible stuff, says that's what's happened over the last 30. We had the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, Industrial. You can see through history that the chunking up of the time it took for these seismic changes has shrunk, and we're now in a realistically probably 10-year window, whereas the
stuff used to happen like binary because they were like functional things. Now these technological things are colliding, and they are creating massive options. They're going in leaps, not in steps.
So processing power is doing that, and the cost of it is coming down because we've all got mobiles and all the rest of it. So there's several phenomena behind that. But most people think if you're in this kind of exponential curve, this is like 40, 50 years, it's now doing that. And because of AI, processing power, quantum, etc., it is on the cusp of doing that. And that will probably take 5 to 10 years. And you either, let's say it might even be 15. And there's a thing called the Turing test. Have you ever come across this thing?
Yes, the Turing test.
So it was predicted, people can look at it online, but essentially it was Alan Turing who suggested there'll come a day when we can't tell the difference between computers and human beings, the Terminator sort of idea. And he talked about this in the 50s, didn't he? And he came up with several logical reasoning tests that a computer couldn't pass because it was binary. And these things will be a useful test in many years to come to test whether computers have become as good as a brain. That's in a nutshell.
It was a test of a machine's ability to exhibit intelligence that was equivalent to humans.
Yeah. And everyone remembers when Big Deep...
Judgment text-based conversations and things like that.
Deep Blue did the chess thing, didn't it? So it was predicted that the Turing test would be passed by 2050. And then some very adventurous people, Google's futurist, a guy called Ray Kurzweil, whatever, there were several futurists said it will be 2040, and it went past last April. The Turing test had just been passed this year. Now, there'll be people that say, is the test still valid or whatever? So put that to one side. It's accelerating and quick, isn't it? And so I think, so what's that mean for fire and rescue service? Well, I think things like the NOG. Can you imagine trying to print out NOG and your own? It's just unprintable now, isn't it? It's got so big, you couldn't even imagine.
It's not a very user-friendly platform, so, I'll be honest.
How on earth can you expect people to get their head around that?
It's not a tactical tool. It suggests that it is the way it's written, but you just can't use it.
No.
Unless you've already learnt it and really, really, really digested the colossal amount of information that's in there, it's relying on intuition and pattern recognition.
Completely. But actually, you use things like whatever, ChatGPT or Grok or Claude or whatever these things, and actually, we're not that far away from something that really smart that says, when you rock up to a job, as you're en route, why don't we have an earpiece that's saying, you're going to high-rise fire, rather than have to look at an MDT, bang, 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 these are the 5 bullet points you should be thinking about en route, and just on your earpiece.
Have you seen the system used by a few ambulance service where you can send a text to the victim and they can bring up the visuals? So I'm saying to myself, like, think of this. So you give him fire survival guidance. You send them a text. They bring it up on their phone. You can map exactly where they are on the building. You overlay that with the schematics of the building. You factor in all of the CCTV information that's already ongoing. You throw that into an algorithm of national operational guidance, the wind direction, the structure of the building, and it will dilute for you tactical considerations for you to apply at that job.
Well, there's an outfit called Twindit. Have you heard of these guys? So they basically send a drone up and kind of digitally record the building from the outside and do a lot of 3D images on the inside and produce a really, really accurate 3D image, a digital twin of a building. This is a commercial package. Command
tablet or tablet command in America. Them on the podcast.
Exactly. So you'll have seen this, Pete. I've not seen, but it'll be out there where you can actually, you've got your BA crew, you say you're going through that, and you show them in 3D, accurately in 3D, where they're going to do their search. That is very, and I'm saying this, we try to...
I know it's not easy, but you can see a logical path to get there. We're not talking about magic black box stuff.
When we brought in cold cutting over a decade ago, I thought we'd be there now. So the problem with this stuff isn't real. It's going to be culture. There'll be a bit about money.
It'll be culture, because you don't like change. But we haven't even got to invest in it because the rest of society is already paying for it.
Yeah, but I do think what will change is other people are getting on and using stuff in their day-to-day lives anyway, whether we like it or not. And I think the ability for the fire service to kind of wrap itself in CPIC, the fire station is almost kind of this impermeable, impenetrable kind of place, isn't it? I think that is irresistibly disappearing and becoming more porous. So I think there are some really exciting opportunities.
Massive. But you could even use it retrospectively to map back over the last 20,000 community safety visits you've been to, the last 50 million IRS reports, and do language learning models on common threads, because the free text boxes, we don't know what to do with half of them now because it's not usable data because we didn't put it in a box. It is usable data if you throw AI blanket and look for common themes, including variations of language used around the UK Fire and Rescue Service, and overlay that into operational context.
If you had access to a decent AI fire research that was global, X, Y, and Z happened, and you said, knock us out an adapted national operational guidance based on the light of this latest knowledge on lithium ion batteries, green walls, whatever, bang, can you knock us out a standard SOP for brigades to follow?
Well, we did it ourselves when we started talking about Lakenhall House and Shirley Towers and Grenfell. Whereas if you speak to Russ Timpson, he will then go, Russ Timpson, if people don't know, the High Rise Tall Buildings Conference, he will go, well, hang on a minute, you're just talking about the UK there. Here's another 20 high-rise fires that have happened around the world that you could be including in your data set. And we go, oh, no, it's different in China. It's different in Dubai. It's different in FDNY. And you're like, no, there's lots of usable data here. You just have to translate it into comparable data, and it's usable. And that's the privilege we have of this global village that we now have access to through communication and technology.
Yeah, absolutely. So with my new hat on the Fire Sector Confederation, we're a very kind of small, agile charity, and we are, from our point of view, if we don't get into this kind of AI revolution and use it well, we're never going to be big enough to. We don't want to grow and have loads. It's not that. It's a charity. And agility is the key to being successful. So we've got freedoms to do things that you wouldn't have if you were part of a kind of bigger organization. So we really want to see if we can use that freedom and agility to maximize some of the possibilities.
How have you found that? Before we close, let's just change gears for a second. Moving out of your former role as a chief fire officer, how have you seen the way that private sector arrange and organize and the agility, and do you look back on some of your stuff and roll your eyes and go, God, the glacial pace that we moved at, is that just indicative of the sector? Will we ever have the bravery and audacity to be able to move in an agile way to some of these technological revolutions? Are you optimistic when you look at this, or do you go, I've had my time, they'll do what they want to do with it?
To be fair, Pete, I'm actually I am optimistic. I don't miss being a fire chief, and I don't envy the task of colleagues as fire chiefs today.
No, yeah. They're an easy target, but I've had a lot of them on the podcast. Yeah. They're very nice people.
I'm going to say, at this point, I'm worried that some of your listeners will be starting to weep emotionally in sympathy for the travails of fire chiefs, but maybe not.
I'm sure they won't. Don't worry.
They get better paid and all the rest of it. But it is hard. There's really the financial, the other constraints, and the political realities. It's a really, really difficult task. I don't envy them that. When I've done 10 years as a hospital chair and done some other stuff, I've met a lot of talented people. I've not met people that I thought were massively more talented than the people I met in the fire and rescue service. And I think the fire and rescue service needs to kind of a little bit get over itself and get over its inferiority complex. And in a way, I think I was as bad as that. The old single tier entry system didn't help. So as you got through, you kind of picked up degrees and masters and all that, almost to prove, I suppose, parity and equity with people in these sectors that seemed far more sophisticated and important.
Yeah.
And what I've learned is the fire service does carry a bit of inferiority complex baggage. And in some respects, we're our own worst enemy. Our culture doesn't help. We do like to knock spots off each other, whether it's in an industrial...
Yeah, we do, don't we?
Or whether it's in a cultural setting. We do quite... And that earlier point about negativity, there is too many men because the lack of balance creates... We're easily tip into a negative...
Mm-hmm.
It's long for us to have a good old whinge at work, does it really?
No.
And actually, by the way, Pete, whatever level of the organisation, it doesn't change a great deal.
No,
actually.
I've learned that, yeah.
And so, and there's a bit that says, and we're constantly told we need to look elsewhere for this excellence and brilliance, and we need to learn from these people over there. And understandably, when people get told enough, you believe it, don't you? And so, that is absolutely not to be complacent, but there is no shortage of talent in fire and rescue service, in the fire and rescue service sector. I think what there is that inferiority complex a little bit, and I think there's a lack of the words are, it's not bravery, it's a kind of preparedness to step forward and be a bit more disruptive, push back a little bit more, and not feel quite so hard that we need permission and agreement such a long time. And I'll come back to Grenfell if I might, Pete.
Please.
Where every single witness was asked, would they change anything? Would they have any regrets? And I'll give all credit to the former Commissioner, Ron Dobson, giving his evidence. And if anybody wants to look, I'd encourage them to do that. So Ron was very honest at the end. And he said there were 2 or 3 things that he wished he'd have done differently. My point about fire safety, one of them was to get the fire safety, fire protection bit of the organisation, bridge the gap between operations and fire protection, fire safety better than he did culturally and otherwise. Second thing he said, though, was that he wished he'd pushed back more. So after the Lakanal House fire, he pushed a concern, and he I wouldn't say he accepted it in a kind of blind or just accept it way. To be fair to Mr. Dobson, I think it would be wrong to say he was just compliant, he went along with things. He didn't, actually. If you look at the correspondence and the evidence, I think it's fair to say he pushed very hard, actually, to make sure the learnings from Lakanal featured in a policy sense elsewhere. So I think he's been a bit unfair to himself in that respect. But his bigger point is that kind of let it then go. At that point, he felt he'd gone as far as he could. He wished he felt to push further. And I think that is another thing. It's hard, isn't it? When NSCC is resourced by colleagues at Home Office, etc., there's a big team, there's a lot of work to be done, and the funding for the resources to do it comes through the avenue it comes. And it's not easy then. And I'm not suggesting to be truculent or be awkward or any of those things, but remembering, and what Grenfell tells us, is this is a very difficult and dangerous job. And sometimes it's incredibly difficult and it's incredibly dangerous. And the people at the top of the organisation, the fire service, are expected to be intellectually curious, professionally curious, and to make sure that what they know to be right, to be correct, to be good, they need to make sure that they present that and keep presenting it, even though the answers might be no for many years. They still need to do that, present themselves in that way. That will be and if I'm honest with you, I see no shortage of talent, resilient and robust people who are more than capable of doing that.
Steve, I think that is a fantastic point to close on, brother. I really, really appreciate your time, mate. I know we've been trying to get this conversation together for a little while. I would love to have some more professional adventures and conversations and work together. I think there's no greater sign of the sort of attitude of the first responder sector than when you see someone who's retired a long time ago, and you're not the only, there's many, still seem to have some personal and professional curiosity to keep trying to come back and nudge the thing that they left ages ago. They say you never stop being a firefighter. A lot of people, you don't see accountants still interested 15, 20 years. With respect, my mum was an accountant.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I always say, how do you know if you're around a firefighter? Don't worry. They'll tell you they used to be a firefighter. You'll know. But no, mate, I love that. And I sincerely hope my own optimism continues to burn, if you excuse the pun.
Rational optimist. That's the best place to be.
I appreciate you, brother.
Keep in touch.
Well, that's it for today, folks. Hope you took a lot away from that episode. We started the Firefighters podcast to develop, inspire, connect, motivate, represent, and most importantly, celebrate the world of incredible emergency services operators and the wider sector through this series of wide-ranging conversations. We really love creating this podcast and bringing it to so many people. Did you know you can also find these on YouTube? We do a lot of video podcasts now. You can head over to our YouTube page and follow, subscribe there. And as a final ask from us, whatever platform you're on, please rate the podcast. It really helps us as a key performance indicator to reach more and more people. I've been your host, Pete Wakefield. This has been the Firefighters podcast. And wherever you are in the world, please stay safe, be happy, live with intention, and where possible, please remember and support your firefighters and first responders. I'll see you next time.